Those who are interested in a more patient and meticulous account of what I'm about to say are invited to look at one of the chapters in a book I've written called Anarchy Alive, which is out in Pluto Press, which kind of lays these out in more detail, as well as one of the recent issues of the journal Anarchist Studies, in which Michael Truskello and I have written an editorial that expresses some of these ideas. So I'll begin with rather simplistic definitions of both anarchism and technology for the purpose of this talk. I'm sure people would like to contest those. But for me, anarchism means essentially the struggle against all forms of domination and inequality in society, using means that prefigure an alternative format of social relations in which these are no longer or well on their way to being abolished. So we're not just talking about some utopian blueprint, but about a living movement and its practices in the first place, from which any reconstruction is projected. By technology, I refer not to the application of knowledge to a given problem or set of problems, which also is a definition that also covers tool use, but instead I refer to the recursive application of knowledge to a social and material space of reality. Recursive in the sense that the outcomes are reutilized as inputs. So we're talking about an accumulative process where machines, devices, and an altered physical landscape come together to reconstruct social roles and relations. So technology cannot really be thought of separately from social relations. And although historically anarchists have been, and today, anarchists have been continue to be ambivalent about technology, and we hear very celebratory voices on the one hand from Peter Kropotkin, who was quite clear on his belief in the inexhaustible resources of science and the ability of automation to solve the problems of the working masses, as long as, of course, they are reinserted into a classless and socialist, communistic society, as well as other voices to that effect, and much more techno-skeptical and even techno-rejectionist voices. What I'd like to present here is what I think could be suggested as a quintessentially anarchist critique of technology that focuses on the power relations that are embedded within technologies themselves. And to approach that, I'd like to look at three distinct arguments against genetic engineering and why they're different. So you have one argument that says, well, there are unknown hazards involved. This may, cause various health effects and so on. This is an argument that I think is strategically weak because it's easy for corporations to code that as risk and bring that into their kind of insurance industry sponsored framework of calculable risks that can be monetized and so on. Another argument is the argument about hubris, right? We don't know what we're doing, we're playing God, and that argument is weak because who is this we, right? There's this notion that we're talking about individual scientists or an undifferentiated humanity, and that doesn't really capture the stratified nature of society and the forces within it that are more responsible than others. And so I think that the critique that genetic engineering is a power multiplier for corporations, increases agriculture's dependency on them, and at least with the case of terminator seeds, encodes property relations into material reality, is a more quintessentially anarchistic critique. And I think that elements of this critique have been anticipated from as early as we'd like to go in the anarchist tradition. I'll quote you briefly from Proudhon in The Philosophy of Poverty. Machines do not go all alone. To keep them in motion, it is necessary to organize an immense service around them, so that in the end, man creating for himself, like this, yes, an amount of work proportional to the number of instruments with which he surrounds himself. The principal consideration in the matter of machinery is much less to divide its products than to see that it is fed. And so what we see here is at least the seed of an anarchist critique which understands that technologies are not neutral, and that doesn't only mean that their use depends on who owns and controls them. It means that a critique where we understand that human ends are deeply transformed through their fitting to technological means. And so, if we look at technological infrastructures, then this critique basically insists that once a technology is deployed, it either requires or strongly encourages particular patterns of human relations, either in its immediate operating environment or also in society at large. I'm not saying that these particular relations are necessarily hierarchical or exploitative or centralizing, but I'm saying that there are tendencies towards certain patterns of human relations that are embedded in the material nature of technologies. The existence of a device like an atomic bomb literally requires an immensely stratified command and control structure around who can even access this thing and when. Doing otherwise would be literally insane. Think also about the way in which society as a whole comes to be reconstructed by the presence of a nuclear arms race or nuclear devices. I think people who lived, in this country or the States in the 50s and 60s and remember drills of getting under their tables and so on, that will speak to them. In the same way that a motor car places one person in the role of steering the vehicle and generates, so immediate operating environment, and tends to generate car-dependent infrastructures in society as a whole. An assembly line paces the workers in a certain way, whether or not they own it. Okay? So now, I've just given examples of technologies where the material nature of the technology itself requires social relations that are centralizing or hierarchical. That is not necessarily the case with every technology. I think that low-tech technologies, and I'll talk about that in a bit, can tend towards decentralization, conviviality, and cooperation rather than towards centralization, command, and or competition. But we have to acknowledge that most technologies that surround us, and I'm not just talking about genetic engineering, but also about much more mundane infrastructures, are imprinted with the biases, expectations, and needs of a capitalist, hierarchical, racist, and sexist society. Usually also we're not talking about a process of technological development that comes in fits and starts, but instead about engineered technological waves that are initiated by elites and controlled by them, with weaker parts of society essentially getting pulled in the undertow as elites ride the crest of the waves. And I think that's exactly what happened with the Luddite struggle. So in that sense, I think that we can look at three main lessons for practice. I'll try to do those in 90 seconds. First of all, if to start from point of view of, let's say, the most comprehensive anti-technological articulation to come from recent anarchist writing or thinking or action, namely the primitivist critique of civilization, I would like to argue that this has raised a lot of controversy, not so much because of any fine-grained analysis of technology, but more about broader baggage that has to do with modernity, enlightenment, and progress. And nevertheless, I think that with the analysis that I've just presented, we can reach the conclusion that at least some measure of technological abolitionism has to be part of an anarchist politics. In other words, you don't need to be a primitivist to be a Luddite. There are some technologies that I think on any account have no place in a free society, and I think that anarchists would probably agree, for example, that most high-end military technologies should simply not exist, okay? Or technologies specific to imprisonment or interrogation, the stuff of the state, okay? So we're talking about one level of technological abolitionism. Secondly, can we talk about a positive view of technology? Yes, I think we can, and have been as anarchists for at least, several decades. One such statement, again, very briefly to quote from John Clark, we're talking about technologies that involve low consumption of resources, utilization of widely dispersed renewable energy, minimal disturbance of ecosystems, human scale, comprehensibility, aesthetic values, feasibility of continual reassessment and redesign in relation to new needs, multifunctionality, tendency to reduce artificial scarcities, incompatibility with bureaucratic structures, conduciveness to production processes that involve enjoyment, creativity, and human development. So far, so good, and I think that we do, as anarchists, have a pretty good indication of what kind of social values we would like as desiderata, as requirements for technologies to be assessed. Okay? We have those. The final element that I want to say is that, although this list is laudable by most measures, I think that a contemporary anarchist politics of technology has to also consider technological reconstruction without neglecting the material legacies of past technologies. The tendencies of our modern era, which we might call the petro-capitalist era, ensure that whatever the future holds, it will involve the legacy of these technologies. In other words, any anarchist politics of technology has to contend with a world that is always already toxic and in various stages of decomposition and collapse. And as we imagine, revolutionary paths, if they are possible, if there is even such a thing, we have to place those not within the context of projecting our desires for convivial and egalitarian technologies onto a blank slate, but with the thought that a new society is not really just built in the shell of the old, but amid its decaying ruins. So, abolitionism and resistance, reconstruction according to those values, and setting those against the background of a collapsing, protracted process of a collapsing capitalism are, I think, the consequences of this critique of power as embedded within technologies for anarchist practice. Thank you.